The moon was nothing but a sliver in the October sky when Mara Whelan slipped through the rotting fence posts of the mining camp. Her breath came in short, white puffs against the bitter cold of the Oregon border country. Behind her, the dogs had already caught her scent. Their baying echoed off the canyon walls like the howls of demons she'd learned to fear. She pressed herself against the rough bark of a ponderosa pine, listening. The camp was coming alive with shouts and curses. Lanterns flickered to life in the darkness, casting wild shadows that danced between the ramshackle buildings. She had perhaps 10 minutes before they organized the search properly. 10 minutes to disappear into the wilderness that stretched endlessly beyond the camp's borders. Mara's fingers, numb with cold, fumbled with the bundle she'd hidden days earlier beneath the wood pile. Dried meat wrapped in oilcloth, a heavy wool coat stolen from the supply shed, and a small skinning knife. Not much, but it would have to do. She'd watched the Snake River from the camp's edge for months, memorizing its course northward. Water meant life. Water meant a path they couldn't easily track. The first rifle shot cracked through the night air, splintering bark from a tree 20 yards to her left. They were shooting blind, trying to flush her out. Mara didn't run. Running made noise, and noise meant death. Instead, she moved like her mother had taught her years ago, before the fever took her, before everything went wrong. Step, pause, listen. Step, pause, listen. The river's voice grew louder as she descended the steep hillside, her boots sliding on loose shale. The early snow had made everything treacherous. Ice crystals clung to the juniper bushes, and the ground beneath was a mix of mud and frost that threatened to send her tumbling with each step. But Mara had learned to be sure-footed in her months of captivity, hauling water up these same slopes under the watchful eyes of armed guards. She thought of the man who called himself her husband, Jacob Thornton, the mine foreman who'd bought her contract from the employment agency in Portland. A wife, he'd told anyone who'd listen, though what he'd really purchased was something far different. The marriage certificate had been signed by a drunk judge who didn't bother to ask if she consented. She'd been 19 then, fresh off the boat from Ireland, believing the promises of honest work in the American West. The dogs were closer now. Mara could distinguish at least 3 different voices in their chorus. Bloodhounds, probably. Thornton took pride in his hunting pack. She reached the river's edge and didn't hesitate. The shock of the cold water drove all breath from her lungs, but she forced herself forward, wading upstream. The current tugged at her skirts, trying to pull her under. Let them follow this, she thought grimly. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Mara hauled herself onto the opposite bank. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably, and she knew she had to get warm soon or the cold would kill her just as surely as Thornton's bullets. She wrung out her skirts as best she could and pulled on the stolen coat. It smelled of tobacco and sweat, but it was thick and warm. The forest on this side of the river was different, older, darker. Giant firs and cedars blocked out even the faint starlight. Mara had never been this far from the camp, but she'd heard the men talk. Indian country, they called it, though she'd never seen any natives. Bears and wolves, too, but those seemed like distant threats compared to what waited behind her. She found a deer trail leading north and followed it, placing each foot carefully to avoid snapping twigs. The sounds of pursuit were fading now, muffled by the river's constant murmur. Maybe they'd given up for the night. Maybe they thought she'd drowned. Or maybe they were just regrouping, waiting for daylight to pick up her trail. Miles away, in a cabin that smelled of leather and wood smoke. Silas Blacktree was cleaning his rifle when the knock came. He didn't get many visitors, which was how he preferred it. The man at his door was Howard Clemens, Thornton's right hand at the mine. "Got a job for you, tracker," Clemens said without preamble. He held out a leather pouch that jinked with the sound of gold coins. "Woman's run off from the camp. Mister. Thornton wants her back." Silas didn't take the pouch immediately. His mother's blood had taught him to read men's faces, and Clemens wore the look of someone with more to say. "A woman?" he asked, his voice carrying just a trace of his Shoshone heritage. "Thornton's wife, Irish girl, about 23. Red hair, green eyes, about this tall." Clemens held his hand at shoulder height. "Took off sometime after midnight. We tracked her to the river, but—" he shrugged. "But your dogs can't follow her through water." Silas finished. He'd seen it before. Desperate people always went for water. "When did she leave?" 3 hours ago, maybe 4. Silas considered. A woman. Alone. In October, the passes would be snowed in within weeks. If she didn't know the country, she'd be dead in days. "What aren't you telling me?" Clemens shifted uncomfortably. "She's difficult. Might be armed. Stole a knife from the kitchen." A kitchen knife against the wilderness. Silas almost smiled. $500, he said finally. "Half now. Half when I bring her back." "That's robbery." "That's my price. Take it or let her freeze." Clemens cursed but counted out the coins. As he turned to leave, he added, "Thornton wants her back intact, you understand? She's his property, legal and proper." After the man left, Silas sat in the darkness for a long time. He'd tracked runaway wives before. It was ugly work, but it paid well. Still, something about this one nagged at him. A woman who'd risk death rather than stay. A husband who sent men with guns after her in the night. He rose before dawn, saddling his paint horse and loading his pack. He knew every trail, every water source, every shelter for 100 miles in any direction. The woman, Mara Whelan. Clemens had finally told him, would be easy enough to find. As he rode toward the mining camp, Silas found himself wondering what kind of woman would run into the October wilderness with nothing but stolen supplies and a kitchen knife. What was she running from that seemed worse than wolves and weather. The sun was just touching the eastern peaks when he reached the place where she'd entered the river. The tracks told the story clearly. The dogs here. The men spread out in a search line. And there, almost invisible unless you knew to look, the marks where she'd climbed down to the water. Silas dismounted and knelt by the bank. A strand of red hair caught on a willow branch confirmed what he already knew. She'd gone upstream, fighting the current, smart. Most people went with the flow, taking the easier path. But she'd chosen the harder way, the one that would confuse the dogs longer. He found where she'd emerged on the far bank, the deep impressions of her boots in the mud, the drops of water on the frost-killed grass. She was maybe 6 hours ahead of him now. Cold, wet, exhausted, but moving north with purpose. Silas swung back into his saddle and forded the river at a shallower spot upstream. As he picked up her trail on the other side, he noticed something that made him pause. Blood. Just a few drops on a sharp rock, probably from her hands as she'd climbed. But it was the pattern that interested him. She'd stopped to wrap the wound, taking precious time to tend to herself when speed might mean survival. The tracker in him cataloged every sign. The length of her stride, shortened by exhaustion. The depth of her prints. She was small, maybe 120 pounds. The direction of travel, unwavering north, following the river. But another part of him, a part he usually kept silent, began to paint a different picture. This wasn't just a runaway wife. This was someone who'd planned, who'd prepared, who was willing to risk everything for... what? As the morning wore on and the trail led deeper into the wilderness, Silas found himself hoping she'd had the sense to steal matches too. The nights were getting colder, and that wet crossing would have chilled her to the bone. Despite himself, he felt a grudging respect growing. Most runners panicked, left obvious signs, circled back on themselves. But Mara Whelan moved like she had a destination in mind, like she knew exactly where she was going. The question was, would she live long enough to get there? The rock overhang wasn't much, but it would keep the worst of the wind off her back. Mara's fingers were so stiff she could barely grip the matches she'd wrapped in oilcloth 3 days before her escape. 3 days of pretending, of playing the broken wife while she stashed supplies bit by bit. The first match broke. The second flickered and died. On the third try, a tiny flame caught the bundle of pine needles and dry moss she'd gathered. She fed the fire carefully, adding twigs no thicker than her finger, then larger pieces as the flames grew stronger. The smoke worried her. It could be seen for miles in clear weather. But hypothermia would kill her faster than any pursuer. Her dress was still damp despite hours of walking, and ice crystals had formed where the hem brushed against bushes. As warmth slowly returned to her limbs, Mara allowed herself to remember, not the recent horrors, those were still too raw, but before. The cottage in County Cork with its thatched roof and the roses her mother grew by the door, the smell of peat fires and soda bread. Her father's laugh, deep and rich, before the blight took the potatoes and the fever took him. She'd been 15 when they buried both parents within a week of each other. The landlord had given her 2 days to clear out. America, the neighbors whispered. In America, there was work for willing hands. In America, a girl could make her own way. So she'd sold everything, her mother's lace curtains, her father's fiddle, even the wooden cross from above the door for passage to New York. The employment agency had seemed like salvation. Domestic positions in the Western Territories, the woman had said, her smile never reaching her eyes. Good families seeking hard-working Irish girls. You'll need to sign a contract, of course, for your own protection. Mara had signed. What choice did she have? The streets of New York were full of Irish girls with empty bellies and emptier pockets. The train journey west had taken 2 weeks, and with each mile, her fellow travelers had grown rougher, harder. By the time they reached Portland, she was one of only 3 women in a car full of miners and drifters. That's where Thornton had been waiting. He'd looked respectable enough, clean-shaven, well-dressed, with hands that hadn't seen much manual labor. "I've come for the domestic help," he'd told the agency representative. But his eyes had moved over the 3 girls like a man selecting livestock. The wedding had happened that same day. Mara had tried to protest, to explain there'd been a mistake. But the contract was clear. She'd agreed to domestic service as required by employer. In Thornton's mind, that meant marriage. The judge, reeking of whiskey at 2 in the afternoon, had performed the ceremony in his chambers. No witnesses except the agency woman, who'd left immediately after, her purse heavier by several gold pieces. A branch cracked in the darkness beyond her small fire, jolting Mara back to the present. She pressed herself against the rock face, hand moving to the knife at her belt. The forest was full of sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the distant howl of wolves. But this had been different, deliberate. Minutes passed. Nothing emerged from the darkness. Gradually, her hammering heart slowed. She added another piece of wood to the fire and tried to think clearly. North. She had to keep going north. In Walla Walla, there was a Catholic mission. She'd heard the men at the camp speak of it with contempt. Indians and Irish, they'd say, spitting tobacco juice. But Father Francis was known to help women in trouble, to ask no questions. It was maybe 100 miles, 5 days if she was careful, a week if the weather turned. She had enough dried meat for 3 days, maybe 4 if she rationed carefully. Water wouldn't be a problem as long as she followed the river, but the cold, she pulled the stolen coat tighter. Already, frost was forming on the fur collar. 2 hours before dawn, she kicked dirt over the dying coals and moved on. The deer trail had petered out, forcing her to pick her way through increasingly dense forest. Fallen logs, some as tall as her waist, blocked her path. She climbed over when she could, crawled under when she had to. Her dress caught and tore on brambles. Her hands, already cut from the river crossing, collected new wounds from thorns and rough bark. The sun was well up when she heard the river change its song. The steady murmur became a roar. Through the trees, she glimpsed white water cascading over massive boulders. The spring rains would swell this to an impassable torrent. But now, in October, it was merely dangerous. Mara studied the crossing for a long time. The main channel was perhaps 30 feet wide, but rocks broke the surface at irregular intervals. If she was careful, if she didn't slip. The first rock was stable. The second shifted slightly under her weight, but held halfway across, the current tugging at her skirts. She heard it again, that deliberate sound of movement in the forest behind her. This time, she caught a glimpse, a rider on a painted horse. sitting motionless at the tree line. Panic shot through her. She moved too quickly to the next rock, felt her boot slip on the wet surface. For a heart-stopping moment, she windmilled her arms, fighting for balance. The river roared beneath her, eager to claim what the mountains hadn't. She found her footing and forced herself to move slowly, carefully, to the far bank. Only when she was safely across did she look back. The rider was gone, but he'd been there. She was sure of it, tall in the saddle, wearing buckskins rather than the rough wool of the miners. And he'd made no move to follow, had simply watched. Silas lowered his field glasses and allowed himself a small nod of approval. The woman had nerve. That crossing would have challenged an experienced mountaineer. Yet she'd managed it in a torn dress and boots meant for kitchen work. When she'd started to fall, he'd actually found himself leaning forward, as if he could somehow steady her from 50 yards away. He'd been tracking her for the better part of a day now, and the signs told an increasingly intriguing story. She'd rested when she needed to, but never too long. She'd built a fire that was small enough to avoid detection but large enough to prevent freezing. She'd even had the foresight to collect pine nuts from a cache probably left by squirrels, supplementing her meager supplies. But it was the other signs that troubled him. Blood on the trail, not just from cuts and scrapes, but older stains on fabric she'd tried to wash in stream water. Bruises on her arms where the sleeves had torn, the way she moved when she thought she was alone, favoring her left side like ribs might be cracked or bruised. Silas had seen enough battered women to recognize the signs. Hell, his own mother had worn similar marks. Gifts from his father during the man's drinking spells. It changed the calculation. A woman running from a husband was one thing. A woman running for her life was another. He guided his horse upstream to where the crossing was easier, then picked up her trail on the far side. She was moving slower now, exhaustion taking its toll. The rain that had threatened all morning finally began to fall. Not heavy, but steady and cold. Her tracks showed where she'd taken shelter under a massive cedar, waiting for the worst to pass. That's where he found the first real sign of her desperation. She'd used the knife to strip bark from the cedar's trunk, the inner bark that his mother's people knew could be eaten in extreme hunger. She'd also gathered the tips of fir branches, tea, maybe, or just something to chew to fool an empty stomach. The rain turned to sleet as afternoon wore on. Silas pulled his own coat tighter and wondered how she was managing with just wool and whatever warmth stubbornness could provide. The smart thing would be to approach her now, while she was cold and exhausted. He had food, dry blankets, a horse that could carry her back to the mining camp in a day's ride. But something held him back. Maybe it was the memory of his mother's face that last morning, when she'd finally found the courage to leave his father. Maybe it was professional curiosity. How far could this slip of an Irish girl go on pure determination? Or maybe it was something else, something he didn't want to examine too closely. The sleet was turning to snow when he finally spotted her again. She'd found another overhang, this one with a natural windbreak of fallen logs. She was trying to start another fire, but her hands were shaking too badly to manage the matches. Silas watched her try 3 times, swearing in what he assumed was Gaelic when each attempt failed. On her 4th try, with the last match, she succeeded. The tiny flame caught, sputtered, nearly died, then grew stronger. She fed it with the dedication of someone who understood that fire meant life. When it was burning steadily, she held her hands over the flames, and he could see her shoulders shaking. Crying, maybe, or just shivering. Maybe both. Silas made his decision. He dismounted and removed a bundle from his saddlebags. Dried venison, hardtack, and most importantly, a rubberized canvas tarp that would keep the rain off. Moving silently, he circled through the forest until he was upwind of her position. He left the bundle where she'd find it when she emerged, then retreated to continue his vigil. It was full dark when she discovered his gift. He watched through the field glasses as she approached it cautiously, knife drawn. She circled it twice before reaching out with a stick to pull back the covering. When she saw what was inside, she froze. For a long moment, she didn't move, just stared at the supplies as if they might vanish. Then she did something that surprised him. She looked up, scanning the darkness beyond her fire. "I know you're out there," she called, her accent thickening the words. "I don't know what game you're playing, but I'll not be beholden to any man." Still, she took the supplies. Practical, despite her pride. She wrapped the tarp around her shoulders and retreated to her shelter. Silas saw her examine the food carefully before eating, probably checking for drugs or poison. Smart girl. He settled in for a long, cold night of watching. Tomorrow, the real test would come. The river valley would narrow into a canyon, forcing her to climb. The passes were already getting snow. If she kept going north, she'd need to make choices that would mean the difference between freedom and freezing. As the snow continued to fall, Silas found himself hoping she'd make the right ones. The tarp had made all the difference. Mara woke before dawn, stiff but not frozen. The rubberized canvas having kept the worst of the snow off during the night, she folded it carefully, knowing it might be the thing that kept her alive in the days to come. The venison was good too, better than the stringy dried beef she'd stolen from the camp. Whoever her mysterious benefactor was, he knew how to prepare trail food. She tried not to think about why someone would help her. In her experience, men didn't give without expecting something in return, but she couldn't afford to refuse the gifts, not when survival hung by such a slender thread. Pride was a luxury she'd lost somewhere between the wedding ceremony and the first night in Thornton's cabin. The canyon walls rose on either side as she followed the river north. The trail, such as it was, clung to the eastern slope, a narrow track probably worn by deer and elk over countless seasons. In places, it disappeared entirely, forcing her to scramble over loose rocks that clattered down toward the water below. More than once, she pressed herself against the cliff face, heart pounding, as stones she dislodged bounced and echoed in the gorge. By midday, the sun had burned through the clouds, turning the snow to slush that made every step treacherous. Mara's boots, never meant for this kind of travel, were coming apart at the seams. Water seeped in with each step, numbing her feet until she could barely feel the ground beneath her. She was concentrating so hard on the placement of each footstep that she almost missed the warning. A deep cough echoed off the canyon walls. Not human, something larger. She froze, scanning the slope above. There, perhaps 50 yards upslope, a massive grizzly bear was digging at a rotten log. Probably after grubs, or maybe a ground squirrel's cache. Mara's mind raced through everything she'd heard the miners say about bears. Don't run. That triggered their chase instinct. Don't look them in the eye. They took it as a challenge. Make yourself big. Make noise. But here on this narrow ledge, with a cliff at her back and a deadly drop below, none of that wisdom seemed applicable. The bear hadn't noticed her yet, intent on its excavation, moving with painful slowness. Mara eased backward along the trail. One step, another. Her boot knocked a stone loose, and it clattered down the slope. The bear's massive head swung around, small eyes fixing on her. For a moment that stretched like eternity. They regarded each other. The bear rose on its hind legs, nose testing the air. Mara gripped the knife at her belt, knowing how useless it would be against 600 pounds of muscle and claw. The bear dropped back to all fours, huffed once, and ambled away upslope, apparently deciding she wasn't worth the trouble. Mara didn't move until the grizzly was long out of sight. Then her legs gave out, and she sat hard on the muddy trail, shaking with delayed reaction. It was several minutes before she could stand again, and when she did, she noticed something glinting on a rock above the trail. An arrow, freshly broken, its point embedded in a tree trunk, a warning shot that had turned the bear's attention upslope instead of down. "Thank you," she whispered to the forest, knowing he was out there, watching. This shadow guardian who seemed determined to keep her alive for reasons she couldn't fathom. Silas retrieved his arrow shaft, examining the break with professional interest. It had been a risky shot, if he'd missed. Or if the bear had charged down slope instead of up, the woman would have been dead before he could reach her. But the old sow had cubs somewhere nearby, making her unpredictable. Better to intervene than to watch Mara Whelan become another casualty of the wilderness. He was breaking his own rules, getting too involved. A tracker's job was simple. Find the target. Return them to whoever was paying. But nothing about this job had been simple from the start. The way Thornton's men had talked about her, the fear in their voices when they mentioned her willfulness, the bruises he'd catalogued from a distance. It all painted a picture he'd seen too many times before. His mother had run once, when Silas was maybe 7. Made it all the way to her sister's camp. 3 days' ride into Shoshone territory. His father had hired trackers then too, had dragged her back with promises of better behavior. The promises had lasted exactly 2 weeks. After that, the bruises had been worse, and she'd never tried to run again. Just endured until the winter she caught pneumonia and didn't fight very hard to recover. Silas shook off the memories and focused on the present. The woman was in trouble. The destroyed boots were slowing her down, and the canyon was about to get worse. 2 miles ahead, a recent landslide had wiped out the deer trail entirely. She'd have to climb up and over, adding miles to her journey and exposing her to the weather at higher elevation. He made another decision that went against every professional instinct. Returning to where he'd tethered his horse, he pulled out a pair of moccasins from his pack. They were old but serviceable, made by his grandmother years ago from elk hide. They'd fit her better than those falling-apart boots and give her feet a chance to recover. The sun was setting by the time he found the right spot to leave them, a distinctive rock formation she couldn't miss. He weighted them down with a stone and added a small bundle of jerky, then retreated to his watching post. Mara found the moccasins just as her right boot finally gave up entirely, the sole separating from the upper with a dispirited flap. She sat on a boulder and examined them carefully, running her fingers over the intricate beadwork. They were beautiful, clearly made with skill and care, and they fit as if made for her, the soft hide conforming to feet that had been rubbed raw by wet leather. "Who are you?" she asked the gathering darkness. "What do you want?" No answer came, but she hadn't really expected one. She packed the ruined boots in her bundle, the leather might still be useful for something, and continued on in her new footwear. The difference was immediate. Her feet could grip the rocks properly, feel the surface beneath her. The hide kept out the water while still allowing her feet to breathe. The landslide, when she reached it, was worse than anything she'd encountered. The entire hillside had come down, leaving a raw scar of mud, boulders, and shattered trees. The river ran brown with the sediment below. There was no way across at this level. Mara studied the slope above. It would mean climbing several hundred feet, then traversing above the slide zone, then descending again on the far side. In good weather with proper equipment, it would be challenging. In her current state, with night falling and new snow beginning to dust the higher elevations, it was nearly suicidal. But what choice did she have? Going back meant Thornton, meant the locked room and the laudanum he forced down her throat when she fought back, meant the nights when he'd come to her smelling of whiskey and violence. Death in these mountains seemed almost preferable. She began to climb. The first 100 feet weren't too bad. The slope was steep but manageable, with enough vegetation to provide handholds, but as she climbed higher, the trees thinned and the ground became increasingly unstable. Loose shale slipped beneath the moccasins. Once, a handhold gave way entirely, and only a desperate grab for a stunted pine kept her from falling. Snow was falling steadily now, obscuring her vision and making every surface slick. Her hands were numb, cut in a dozen places from sharp rocks and thorns. The stolen coat, so warm at lower elevation, seemed paper-thin against the wind that howled across the exposed slope. Halfway across the traverse, disaster struck. The ledge she was following simply ended, crumbled away in some previous erosion. The gap was perhaps 6 feet, not far, but the landing looked unstable, and the drop below was fatal. Mara pressed against the cliff face, trying to think through chattering teeth. Go back? The ledge behind her was already collecting snow, becoming more dangerous by the minute. Go down? The slide zone below was a death trap of unstable debris. That left up or across. Up meant more exposure, More climbing in conditions that were deteriorating rapidly. Across meant one jump, one moment of faith that her exhausted body could make the distance. She closed her eyes, said a prayer her mother had taught her, and jumped. She made it, barely. Her fingers caught the far edge as her body slammed into the rock face. For a terrifying moment, she hung there, feet scrabbling for purchase. Then she found a toehold and hauled herself up, collapsing on the narrow ledge in a heap. That's when she saw him clearly for the first time. He was already moving, coming up the slope with the fluid grace of someone born to these mountains. Not running, but covering ground with steady, economical movements. He'd abandoned concealment, and she could see the concern written on his weathered features. "Stay there," he called, his voice carrying despite the wind. "Don't move." Mara wanted to protest, to maintain her independence, but her body had reached its limits. She could only watch as he navigated the traverse she'd barely survived, making it look easy. When he reached her, she noticed his eyes first, dark brown with flecks of gold, holding neither pity nor judgment. "Storm coming in fast," he said, already pulling a coil of rope from his pack. "There's shelter below if we can reach it." "Can you walk?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. He helped her to her feet, and she was surprised by the gentleness in his hands. This close, she could smell wood smoke and leather, see the lines around his eyes that spoke of years squinting into sun and snow. "I'm not going back," she managed to say through chattering teeth. "I don't care what he's paying you." Something shifted in his expression. "We'll discuss that when you're not freezing to death. For now, just focus on walking." He tied the rope around her waist, then his own, leaving about 10 feet between them. If one of them fell, the other might be able to arrest the slide. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The descent was a nightmare of controlled falls and desperate grabs for handholds, more than once. Silas's strength was all that kept her from pitching headfirst down the slope. By the time they reached the bottom, Mara could no longer feel her feet, and violent shivers racked her frame. The shelter he'd mentioned turned out to be a cave, really more of a deep overhang with walls blackened by ancient fires. He had her inside, and a fire started with practiced efficiency. Only when the flames were crackling steadily did he turn his attention back to her. "We need to get you warm," he said, his tone matter of fact. "Those wet clothes will kill you faster than the cold." Mara's eyes widened in alarm, but he was already pulling a dry shirt and blanket from a cache apparently stored in the cave. "I'll step outside," he said. "Change into these and wrap up in the blankets. Your modesty isn't worth your life." After he left, Mara struggled out of her sodden dress with fingers that barely functioned. The shirt was far too large, but blessedly dry and warm. She wrapped herself in the blankets and huddled as close to the fire as she dared. Gradually, painfully, feeling return to her extremities. When Silas returned, he had an armload of wood and a small pot that he filled with snow and set to heating. "Tea," he explained, producing a leather pouch of dried leaves. "It'll help." They sat in silence while the snow melted and the tea steeped. Finally, Mara asked, "Why?" He knew what she meant. "Started as a job," he admitted. "Thornton hired me to bring back his runaway wife." He saw her stiffen and continued quickly. "But I've been watching—" "Seen the blood, the bruises, the way you move like you're hurting. That changes things. So what now?" Her voice was carefully neutral. Silas poured the tea into 2 battered cups, handing her one. "Now we wait out the storm. Come morning, we'll see what your options are. There's a mission about 60 miles north, but the passes," he shook his head, "might already be closed, might not. And if they are?" He met her eyes steadily. "Then we find another way. I'm done dragging women back to men who hurt them." For the first time since she'd run, Mara felt something loosen in her chest. Not quite hope, she'd learned better than that, but maybe the possibility of it. She sipped the bitter tea and watched the flames dance while outside the storm raged on, sealing them in together for whatever came next. The fever came on fast. One moment Mara was sipping tea by the fire. The next, she was shaking uncontrollably, her skin burning despite the chills that racked her body. The combination of exhaustion, exposure, and the infected cuts on her hands had finally overwhelmed her system. Silas recognized the signs immediately. He'd seen mountain fever before, knew how quickly it could turn deadly without proper care. He moved her closer to the fire, piling every blanket he had around her trembling form. Her eyes had gone glassy, unfocused, and when he touched her forehead, the heat nearly burned his palm. "No," she muttered, pushing weakly at his hands. Don't touch." Even in delirium, the fear was there, bone deep and automatic. "Easy," he said, keeping his voice low and steady, the same tone he used with spooked horses. "Just trying to help. No one's going to hurt you." He needed to bring the fever down, but that meant undressing her partially, cooling her skin with wet cloths, the very thing that would terrify her most. Silas wrestled with the decision for a moment before practicality won. He couldn't let her die out of respect for her fears. Working as quickly and impersonally as possible, he unlaced the shirt enough to access her neck and arms. The bruises he found there made him curse under his breath. Finger marks on her upper arms, older ones gone yellow-green on her ribs visible through the opened shirt, a half-healed cut along her collarbone that looked suspiciously like a knife wound. He wet strips of cloth in cool water from melted snow and began the tedious process of fever management. Cool the skin, let it warm, cool again, keep her hydrated when she was lucid enough to swallow, fight the infection with willow bark tea and prayers to whatever spirits might be listening. Through it all, Mara drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes she spoke in Gaelic, long rambling monologues he couldn't understand but recognized as arguments. Pleas, defiance. Other times she called for her mother, her voice small and young. Once she grabbed his hand with surprising strength and said clearly, "I won't go back. Kill me first, but I won't go back." "You won't have to," Silas promised, squeezing her hand gently. "No one's taking you anywhere you don't want to go." The second night was the worst. Her breathing became labored, rattling in her chest. Silas had medicinal plants in his pack, echinacea root, oregano oil, things his grandmother had taught him. But he needed something stronger. He made a decision that surprised him with its desperation. He prayed, not to the Christian God of his father or even the spirits of his mother's people, but to whatever force had kept this woman running against all odds. "She's come too far to die now," he said to the flickering shadows on the cave walls. "Whatever's driving her, it's stronger than this fever. Help her find that strength again, whether it was the herbs, the prayer, or just her own stubborn will." The fever broke near dawn. Mara's breathing eased, and natural sleep replaced the restless delirium. Silas allowed himself to slump against the cave wall, exhausted from 2 nights of vigilance. He woke to find her watching him with those startling green eyes, clearer now but wary. She'd pulled the blankets up to her chin, recreating a barrier between them. "How long?" she asked, her voice hoarse. 3 days. The fever broke this morning." She absorbed this, then noticed the damp cloths, the medicinal supplies scattered around. Understanding dawned, followed by a flush that had nothing to do with fever. "You tended me. You would have died otherwise." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, she said, "I remember pieces. You could have, but you didn't." "I'm not Thornton," Silas said simply. "Not all men are." Tears gathered in her eyes but didn't fall. "I don't know how to trust that." "You don't have to. Trust your own judgment instead." "Have I done anything to harm you?" She considered this with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned to question everything. "No," she admitted finally. "You saved my life. More than once." "Why?" Silas poked at the fire, buying time to organize thoughts he hadn't fully examined himself. "My mother was Shoshone. My father was a trapper, a white man who charmed her away from her people with promises he never intended to keep. He wasn't kind. She tried to run once when I was young. He hired trackers, brought her back." Understanding flickered in Mara's eyes. What happened to her? She died when I was 12. Pneumonia, the doctor said, but I think she just gave up, stopped fighting. He met her gaze directly. I became a tracker because I was good at it, because it paid well. But every woman I brought back to a husband she'd run from. I wondered if I was sending another version of my mother to her death. So why keep doing it? Because I told myself they weren't my mother. Because the money was good. Because I was young and stupid and thought surviving was more important than living with conscience. He added another stick to the fire. Then I saw you on that cliff face yesterday, willing to risk death rather than go back, and I couldn't pretend anymore. Mara studied him for a long moment. He had an interesting face, she realized. Not handsome in the conventional sense, but strong, weathered. The mixed heritage showed in his high cheekbones and straight black hair, but also in the lighter brown of his eyes, the subtle differences that marked him as belonging to both worlds and neither. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you eat something and get your strength back. The storm's passed, but the snow's deep. We'll need to wait a day or two before traveling. And then, there's still the mission at Walla Walla, if you want to try for it, or—" He hesitated. "There's a town about 40 miles east, Copper Creek. The sheriff there is a decent man, owes me a favor. He might be able to help with the legal side of things." "Legal?" Mara's laugh was bitter. "I signed a contract. The marriage is legal, in the eyes of the law. I'm Thornton's property. Laws can be challenged, especially if there's evidence of abuse. Sheriff Morrison's sister went through something similar. He knows the arguments. Hope that dangerous emotion she'd thought beaten out of her stirred again. You'd help me, even though it means giving up Thornton's money." "Already gave it up," Silas said. "Sent his man Clemens packing yesterday while you were fevered. Told him I'd lost your trail in the storm. He wasn't happy, but he's also not stupid enough to call me a liar to my face. He'll hire others." "Probably. But most trackers won't work these mountains in winter. You've got time to disappear properly. Maybe head south to California or north to British Columbia. Get far enough away that it's not worth his money to chase you." Over the next 2 days, as Mara recovered her strength, they fell into an easy rhythm. Silas would venture out to hunt or gather firewood while she rested. In the evenings, they'd share meals of rabbit stew or venison, and she found herself talking more than she had in years. She told him about Ireland, about the green hills and gray seas, about her parents and the cottage with roses, about the ship to America, packed with desperate people fleeing starvation, about the hope she'd carried and how it had curdled into something else entirely. In return, Silas shared stories of growing up between worlds, the Shoshone grandmother who'd taught him to read sign and track game, the white grandfather who'd insisted he learn letters and numbers, the constant feeling of being not quite enough for either side. "Is that why you live alone?" Mara asked on their last night in the cave. "Partly. Also just suits my nature. I like the quiet, like being able to move without explaining myself to anyone." "Don't you get lonely?" He considered this. "Sometimes, but lonely and alone aren't the same thing. I'd rather be alone by choice than together by force." "Like I was," she said softly. "Like you were, but not anymore." The simple statement, delivered without fanfare, made her throat tight with emotion. She'd been property for so long, she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen as a person. That night, the temperature dropped dramatically. Even with the fire built high, the cold seeped through the rock walls. Silas had given her all the blankets, leaving himself with only his coat. She could hear his teeth chattering in the darkness. "This is foolish," she said finally. "We'll both freeze out of stubborn pride." "I'm fine," he lied. "You're not, and I'm not. I can't be afraid forever." Before she could lose her nerve, she scooted over and lifted the edge of the blankets. Just warmth. Nothing more. He hesitated, and she could feel him weighing her comfort against practical necessity. Finally, he moved closer, careful to maintain distance between their bodies even as they shared covering. But as the night wore on and exhaustion claimed them both, The careful distance disappeared. She woke once to find his arm around her waist, her back pressed against his chest. Instead of the panic she expected, she felt safe, protected. For the first time in longer than she could remember, the nightmares stayed away. When dawn light filtered into the cave, they pulled apart awkwardly, neither acknowledging the moment, but something had shifted between them. As they prepared to leave their shelter, Silas caught her arm gently. "Mara," he said, then seemed to run out of words. She waited, watching emotions play across his usually stoic features. "Whatever you decide," he said finally. "Wherever you choose to go, you don't have to do it alone. Not if you don't want to." The offer hung between them, fragile as new ice. She wanted to say yes, wanted to trust this feeling growing in her chest. But the wounds were still too fresh, the fear too deep. "Ask me again," she said softly. "When I'm free, when I'm choosing as myself, not as someone's runaway property." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I'll ask again," he promised. They left the cave as the sun climbed over the eastern peaks, painting the snow-covered world in shades of gold and rose. Whatever lay ahead, legal battles, pursuit, an uncertain future. For now, they walked together, and that was enough. The morning sun had barely crested the mountains when Mara heard the dogs. Their baying echoed through the valley, still distant but unmistakably heading their way. She froze on the trail, one hand instinctively moving to the knife at her belt. "How many?" Silas asked, already scanning the terrain with practiced eyes. "3, maybe 4. The sound brought back visceral memories of her first night running. "They found us. Not us. You. They don't know I'm here." He pointed to a ridgeline about 200 yards above them. "Can you make it up there?" She nodded, though her body was still weak from the fever. "What are you going to do?" "Buy time. Go. Now." Mara wanted to protest, but the dogs were getting closer. She scrambled up the slope, using scattered pines for handholds. Behind her, she heard Silas moving in the opposite direction, deliberately leaving obvious tracks leading away from her path. From her vantage point in a cluster of boulders, she could see them coming up the valley. 3 men on horseback, with 4 hounds straining at their leads. She recognized 2 of them, Clemens and a man called Big Tom, who worked security at the mine. The third was a stranger, lean and cold-eyed, wearing the long coat of a professional bounty hunter. They stopped where the trails diverged. The dogs milled in confusion, catching both scents. Clemens dismounted, studying the ground, even from a distance. Mara could see his frustration. "Tracks are fresh," Big Tom said. "Can't be more than an hour ahead. 2 sets." The bounty hunter observed. His voice carried clearly in the still mountain air. "Someone's with her. That lying half-breed tracker." Clemens spat. "Thornton's gonna have his hide." They decided to split up. Clemens and Big Tom followed Silas's false trail while the bounty hunter, after studying the tracks more carefully, started up the slope toward Mara's hiding spot. He'd seen through the deception. Mara pressed herself deeper into the rocks, barely breathing. The man climbed steadily, following her path with unnerving accuracy. His hand rested casually on the pistol at his hip. 20 yards. 10. He'd see her any moment. The arrow took him in the shoulder, spinning him around. He cursed, drawing his weapon, but a second arrow knocked it from his hand. Silas emerged from behind a deadfall like a ghost. Another arrow already knocked. "Next one goes in your throat," he said conversationally. "Call off the dogs." The bounty hunter, one hand pressed to his bleeding shoulder, complied. The hounds retreated, whining. In the distance, shouts indicated Clemens and Big Tom had heard the commotion. "The woman's mine by law," the hunter said through gritted teeth. "You're interfering with legal recovery of property." "Funny thing about laws," Silas replied. "They only matter if someone's around to enforce them." The sound of horses crashing through underbrush grew closer. Silas grabbed the bounty hunter's pistol and tossed it into the ravine. "You've got 2 choices. Ride out now and keep your life, or stay and lose it." Choose quick." The man looked into Silas's eyes and saw his own death reflected there. When Clemens and Big Tom burst into the clearing, he was already staggering back down the slope. "Mount up," he told them curtly. "We're leaving." "Like hell we are," Clemens protested. "She's right there. And so's an arrow with your name on it." The bounty hunter cut him off. "The tracker's gone native. You want to fight him on his own ground, in these mountains? Be my guest. I'll be sure to tell Thornton how you died." It took another tense minute, but eventually they retreated. Mara waited until the sound of horses faded completely before emerging from her hiding spot. Her legs shook as she made her way down to where Silas stood. "Thank you," she said simply. He was staring after the riders, his expression grim. "They'll be back, with more men. We've got maybe 2 days before—" His words cut off as she threw her arms around him, burying her face against his chest. For a moment, he stood frozen. Then slowly, carefully, his arms came up to encircle her. "I thought he was going to find me," she whispered. "I thought it was over." "Not while I'm breathing," he said into her hair. She pulled back to look at him, and something in his expression made her heart skip. Without thinking, she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. It was awkward, desperate, tasting of fear and relief and something else entirely. Silas went very still. Then his hand came up to cup her face, and he kissed her back with careful tenderness. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Mara," he said roughly, "this isn't— You've been through so much, I don't want to take advantage." "You're not," she interrupted. "For the first time in years, I'm choosing. Do you understand? I'm choosing." He searched her face, then nodded slowly. But when she leaned in again, he caught her shoulders gently. "Not here, not with them so close and you still healing. When we're safe, when you're free, then ask me again." The rejection stung, but she saw the wisdom in it, and the promise. "When I'm free," she agreed. They traveled hard the rest of the day, pushing deeper into the mountains. Silas led them away from the main trails, following game paths and stream beds. By nightfall, they'd covered nearly 15 miles, but Mara was flagging badly. "Here," Silas said, guiding her into another cave, smaller than their previous shelter but hidden behind a waterfall that would mask their smoke. "Rest, I need to backtrack. Cover our trail better." She wanted to protest being left alone, but exhaustion won. When he returned 2 hours later, she was curled near the small fire he'd left, shivering despite the blankets. "Still weak from the fever," he diagnosed, adding wood to the fire. "You pushed too hard today. Didn't have much choice." "No, you didn't." He unpacked dried meat and the last of their tea. "But tomorrow we do. There's a place I know, about a day's ride from here. An old trapper's cabin, abandoned but solid. We could hole up there for a week, maybe 2, let you recover properly, figure out our next move." "Hour?" He looked up from the fire. "Unless you'd rather go alone." "No," she said quickly. "No, I want you to stay. But Silas, this isn't your fight. You don't owe me anything." "Maybe not, but I'm making it my fight anyway." He handed her a cup of tea. "My grandmother used to tell stories about the old days, before the white men came in numbers. She said a warrior's honor wasn't in how many enemies he killed, but in who he chose to protect. I'm choosing to protect you, Mara Whelan, if you'll let me." Tears burned her eyes. "I don't even know how to thank you." "Then don't. Just get stronger. That's thanks enough." That night, she dreamed of Thornton. He found her in the cave, dragged her out by her hair. She woke gasping, hand reaching for the knife, but instead of cave walls, she saw stars through pine branches. Instead of Thornton, Silas sat watch by the fire, cleaning his rifle with methodical movements. "Bad dream?" he asked without looking up. "Memory," she corrected, sitting up. "How long until dawn?" "Few hours yet. Go back to sleep." But sleep felt impossible now. She moved to sit beside him, careful to maintain some distance. Tell me about the cabin. Built it myself. Actually, well, rebuilt it. Found the ruins years ago. Fixed it up as a winter camp. It's good land. Creek nearby. Plenty of game. Isolated enough that no one bothers with it. Sounds like paradise. Can be. Also can be hard. Snows get deep. Nearest town is 3 days' ride in good weather. Week or more in bad. But free. Yes, free. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire. Finally, Mara asked. What made you leave Clemens? Really? You could have told them I gave you the slip, kept the money. Silas was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, when I was tracking you, I kept finding things, small things. Places where you'd shared your food with birds. A snare you'd set but hadn't checked, like you couldn't bear to find something caught. A flower you'd picked and left on a rock, just because it was pretty. He glanced at her. Thornton described a wild, violent woman who'd attacked him and stolen from him. But the trail told a different story. Story of someone gentle trying to survive. Someone who'd rather die free than live caged. I'm not gentle, Mara said softly. Not anymore. He took that from me. No, he tried to, but it's still there. I've seen it. He set aside the rifle. When you tend the fire, when you fold the blankets just so, when you think I'm not watching and you smile at the sunrise, gentle isn't weak. Mara, sometimes it's the strongest thing there is. She couldn't speak past the tightness in her throat. Instead, she shifted closer, laying her head on his shoulder. He tensed briefly, then relaxed, one arm coming around her carefully. Silas? She said after a while. When I'm free, when I've figured out who I am without fear, I think I'll want to see that cabin. His arm tightened slightly. It'll be there. So will I. They stayed that way until dawn, drawing comfort from simple closeness. When the sun rose, painting the mountains gold and crimson, Mara felt something she hadn't experienced in so long she'd almost forgotten its name. Hope. It was a dangerous thing. Hope. It made you vulnerable, made you believe things could be different. But as they broke camp and headed deeper into the wilderness, toward a hidden cabin and an uncertain future, Mara decided perhaps a little danger was worth it. After all, she'd already risked everything for freedom. What was one more leap of faith? The attack came at dusk, just as they'd stopped to water the horses at a mountain stream. Mara had bent to fill their canteens when rough hands seized her from behind. She managed one sharp cry before a filthy palm clamped over her mouth. Well, the runaway bride herself. The voice was unfamiliar, whiskey rough and mean. Thornton's gonna be real happy to see you again, missus. There were 3 of them, different from the earlier group. These weren't Thornton's men, but bounty hunters who'd caught wind of the reward. The one holding her reeked of stale sweat and tobacco. Another trained a shotgun on Silas, who'd frozen with his hands visible. Easy there, breed. The one with the shotgun drawled. This ain't your concern no more. We're just collecting what's ours by right of capture. The third man, older and craftier looking, was already binding Mara's wrists with rough rope. She fought, using elbows and feet, catching him hard in the ribs. He backhanded her casually, splitting her lip. Feisty thing, ain't she? He grinned, showing yellowed teeth. Can see why Thornton wants her back so bad. Silas hadn't moved, but Mara could see the tension coiling in his body. His eyes met hers, and she saw him mouth one word. Ready? She gave the tiniest nod. What happened next was almost too fast to follow. Silas dropped and rolled, the shotgun blast passing over his head. His knife was in his hand before he came up, taking the gunman in the belly. The man holding Mara loosened his grip in surprise, and she drove her head back into his nose with a wet crunch. The older bounty hunter went for his pistol, but Mara, hands still bound, grabbed the knife from her belt and slashed at him. He jerked back, cursing, the blade catching his gun hand. The weapon spun away into the underbrush. Silas was grappling with the one he'd stabbed, both men rolling dangerously close to the stream's edge. The man whose nose Mara had broken stumbled after her, blood streaming down his face. She backed away, trying to maneuver with her hands tied, nearly tripping over exposed roots. "You little witch," he snarled, pulling his own knife. "Gonna mark up that pretty face. See how Thornton likes you then?" He lunged. Mara twisted aside, but not fast enough. The blade caught her sleeve, slicing through fabric and skin. Pain flared along her arm. She stumbled. Going to one knee, the bounty hunter raised his knife for a killing stroke, and an arrow sprouted from his chest. He looked down at it in surprise before toppling backward. Silas stood at the forest's edge, already knocking another arrow. The older bounty hunter, clutching his bleeding hand, took one look and ran. They could hear him crashing through the underbrush, heading for wherever they'd left their horses. "Let him go," Silas said, lowering his bow. He moved quickly to Mara, cutting her bonds. "You're hurt. It's not deep." But her voice shook, and when he peeled back the torn fabric, blood flowed freely down her arm. Deep enough. He tore a strip from his shirt, binding the wound with practiced efficiency. "We need to move. That one who ran will bring others." They left the bodies where they'd fallen. Harsh justice of the frontier. Silas retrieved what supplies he could from the dead men, including ammunition and a decent rifle. Mara tried not to look at the corpses, but part of her felt a grim satisfaction. These men had chosen to hunt her like an animal. They'd paid the price. They rode through the night, Silas pushing them hard. Mara's arm throbbed with each jostle of the horse, and she could feel blood seeping through the makeshift bandage. But she said nothing, gritting her teeth against the pain. They couldn't afford to stop. Dawn found them in high country, above the tree line where patches of snow lingered even in October. The horses were exhausted, sides heaving. Silas finally called a halt in a cluster of wind-twisted pines. "Let me see," he said, helping her down from the saddle. The wound was worse than she'd admitted. The knife had laid her arm open from elbow to wrist, not life-threatening, but bad enough. Silas cleaned it with whiskey from the bounty hunter's supplies, and Mara bit down on a leather strap to keep from crying out. "Need stitching," he said. "I can do it, but do it." She met his eye steadily. "I trust you." His hands were gentle but sure as he worked, using a needle and thread from his pack. Mara focused on his face, the concentration in his dark eyes, the way he murmured soft words in what she thought might be Shoshone. It still hurt, but somehow his presence made it bearable. "There," he tied off the last stitch. "It'll scar, but you'll have full use of the arm." "Another mark," she said with bitter humor. "I'm collecting quite a set." "Marks of survival," Silas corrected. "Nothing to be ashamed of." They rested for a few hours in the pines, taking turns keeping watch. Mara dozed fitfully, jerking awake each time the wind shifted. When they moved on, the landscape had changed. They were entering Silas's territory now, wild country that few white men knew. "The cabin's just over that ridge," he said as afternoon shadows lengthened. Another hour, maybe less. But as they crested the ridge, Silas pulled up short, cursing under his breath. Smoke rose from the valley below, too much smoke for a cook fire. Through the trees, they could see flames. The cabin was burning. "No," Silas breathed. He urged his horse down the slope at a dangerous pace, Mara following. But even before they reached the clearing, it was clear they were too late. The structure was fully engulfed, years of careful work reduced to char and ember. Standing in front of the inferno, watching with satisfaction, were 5 men. Thornton himself was among them, his city clothes incongruous in the wilderness setting. He turned at their approach, a smile spreading across his broad face. "Hello, wife," he said pleasantly. "Time to come home." The men with him spread out, rifles ready. Silas and Mara were outnumbered, outgunned. There was nowhere to run. "Mr. Blacktree," Thornton continued, "I'm disappointed. You came so highly recommended. Yet here you are, stealing another man's property." "She's not property," Silas said quietly. "She's a person. The law says different. I have a legal marriage certificate, bills of sale, all proper and binding." Thornton's eyes never left Mara. "You've led me quite a chase, my dear. Cost me considerable money and embarrassment. That's going to require correction." Mara's hand moved to her knife, but 3 rifles swung her way. "Try it," one of the men encouraged. "Please. Now. Now." Thornton held up a hand. "No need for unpleasantness. Not if everyone cooperates. Mara, you'll come with me. Mr. Blacktree, you'll ride away and forget this ever happened. Everyone lives, everyone wins." "Except her," Silas said. Thornton's genial mask slipped, revealing something cruel beneath. "She's my wife. What happens between us is no concern of yours." "I'll die first," Mara said. Her voice didn't shake. "I'll die before I go back with you." "No, my dear, you won't." Thornton drew his pistol, but instead of aiming at her, he pointed it at Silas. "You'll come quietly, or I'll kill him. Right here, right now. Your choice." Mara felt the world narrow to a single point of clarity. All her running, all her fighting, and it came down to this: her freedom or Silas's life. No choice at all. "Really, don't," Silas said urgently. "Mara, don't." "I'm sorry," she whispered. Then, louder, "I'll come. Just don't hurt him." "Excellent choice." Thornton gestured to his men. "Tie her hands and hobble the breed's horse. Wouldn't want him following too quickly." As rough hands bound her wrists again, Mara kept her eyes on Silas. So much she wanted to say, but the words wouldn't come. He sat rigid in his saddle, fury and anguish warring on his face. "Oh, one more thing," Thornton said casually. He turned and shot Silas's horse through the head. The animal collapsed, nearly pinning Silas beneath it. Now he won't be tempted to follow at all. They dragged Mara to a spare horse, hauling her into the saddle. As Thornton's party began to move out, she looked back one last time. Silas stood beside his dead horse, the burning cabin painting everything in shades of hell. "I'll find you," he called out, his voice carrying clearly. "No matter how far he takes you, I'll find you." Thornton laughed. "You're welcome to try. Half-breed. I'll be ready." As they rode away, Mara held on to those words like a lifeline. Silas would come. She just had to survive until he did, just had to endure whatever came next. Behind them, the cabin collapsed in a shower of sparks, and darkness swallowed the mountains. The journey north was nothing like her desperate flight weeks before. This time, Mara rode with her hands bound to the saddle horn, surrounded by armed men who watched her constantly. Thornton had learned from her escape. She was never left alone, never given the slightest opportunity. But something had changed in her. The fear that had driven her original flight was still there, but tempered now by something harder. She'd tasted freedom. She'd known what it felt like to be treated with respect, with gentleness. Silas had shown her that, and no amount of captivity could take the memory away. "You're quiet," Thornton observed on their second day of travel. He rode beside her, immaculate despite the trail dust. Planning another escape, perhaps? No. She kept her eyes on the mountains receding behind them. Somewhere back there, Silas was already following. She was sure of it. "Good. You've caused enough trouble already." His conversational tone didn't match the coldness in his eyes. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing it's been? Having to explain to business associates that my own wife ran off? The jokes they made?" Mara said nothing. She'd learned long ago that silence was sometimes the only safe response. Still, Thornton adjusted his gloves with fastidious care. "We'll put all that behind us once we're home. A few weeks of re-education, and you'll remember your place." The threat hung between them like a physical presence. Mara forced herself to show no reaction, but inside, her mind was working. Silas would need time to find another horse, to track them. She had to delay their arrival at the mining camp as long as possible. That night, when they made camp, she began to cough, small at first, then harder, bringing up flecks of blood she'd bitten from her own cheek. "What's wrong with her?" Clemens demanded, backing away. The fever, Mara gasped between coughs. From the cold. It's come back. It wasn't entirely a lie. The night's sleeping rough had left her genuinely weakened, and forcing the coughs made them real enough. By morning, she was running a legitimate low fever, though not as serious as she made it appear. We should push on, Clemens advised. Leave her if she can't keep up. Don't be stupid, Thornton snapped. She's worthless to me, dead. We'll rest here today. Let her recover. One day gained. Mara lay in the small tent they'd pitched for her, conserving her strength and listening to the men argue outside. Some wanted to abandon her. Others feared Thornton's wrath if they returned empty-handed. The debate gave her hope. Dissension in their ranks could only help. By the third day, she'd recovered enough to travel, though she made sure to appear weaker than she was. They were following a different route than she'd taken, main trails instead of deer paths, heading for a frontier town called Cedar Ridge where Thornton had business interests. It was there, while the men were distracted with supplying themselves at the general store, that Mara saw her chance. Not to escape, there were still too many eyes on her, but to leave a message. The store owner's wife, a weathered woman named Mrs. Holcomb, brought out coffee for the men when she passed near Mara, still bound to her horse. Their eyes met. Something in the older woman's expression shifted, recognition of one woman's distress by another who'd perhaps seen too much. Please, Mara whispered, barely moving her lips. Tell Sheriff Morrison in Copper Creek. Tell him Silas Blacktree needs to know. Cedar Ridge, then north to Thompson's Ferry. Mrs. Holcomb gave no sign she'd heard, but when she went back inside, Mara caught a glimpse of her speaking urgently to a young boy who slipped out the back door moments later. Making friends. Thornton had noticed the exchange. He grabbed Mara's chin, forcing her to meet his eyes. That would be very foolish. I asked for water. Mara lied steadily. She said she'd bring some. He studied her for a long moment, then released her roughly. You're becoming quite accomplished at deception. I'll have to remember that. They left Cedar Ridge within the hour. But Mara had done what she could. The message would travel, she hoped. Mountain communities had their own ways of passing information. If Silas was following, when Silas was following, he'd know which way they'd gone. The next days blurred together. They were in lower country now, pine forests giving way to scrub and grassland. The weather warmed, but autumn rain turned the trails to mud. Their progress slowed, horses struggling through the mire. It was during one such delay, with the men dismounted to lead their horses through a particularly bad stretch, that Mara heard it, the distinctive call of a mountain jay. Except mountain jays didn't live this low. Her heart leaped. It was a signal. Had to be. She scanned the surrounding hills, seeing nothing, but he was out there. She knew it with bone-deep certainty. That night, Thornton posted double guards. Getting jumpy, boss? One of the men asked. Cautious, Thornton corrected. That half-breed tracker has a reputation. He won't give up easily. 1 man against 6? The guard spat tobacco juice. I like those odds. 1 man who knows these mountains better than you know your own name, Thornton replied. Stay alert. But alertness couldn't prevent what happened next. The guard on the midnight watch simply vanished. No cry, no struggle. They found him at dawn, tied to a tree 100 yards from camp, unconscious but alive. Pinned to his shirt was a piece of paper with 2 words. Release her. Damn him, Thornton snarled. He paced the camp like a caged animal while his remaining men looked nervously at the surrounding forest. He thinks he can intimidate me. The second night, it was the horses. They woke to find the animals' hobbles cut, though the horses hadn't wandered far. Another message, this one carved into a tree. Last warning. Maybe we should, Clemens began. Should what? Thornton rounded on him. Give up. Let her go. Show everyone that Jacob Thornton can be frightened by some mongrel savage. He's picking us off, another man muttered. Jim's still dizzy from whatever he used to knock him out. The horses are spooked. We're all jumping at shadows. Then stop jumping and start thinking. Thornton drew his pistol. checking the loads. He wants to scare us into making a mistake. We keep our heads, stay together, and push through to Thompson's Ferry. There's a garrison there. Let him try his tricks against the U.S. Army." But Silas wasn't finished. The third night brought no attacks, no missing guards. Instead, they woke to find Mara's bonds cut. Though she hadn't moved from her bedroll, she could have escaped. The message was clear, but she'd stayed. Why? Because pinned to Thornton's own coat was a final note. "Thompson's Ferry, noon. Come alone or she dies." The words were a lie. Mara knew Silas would never harm her, but Thornton didn't know that. She watched him read the note, saw his face cycle through rage, calculation, and finally, a cold sort of satisfaction. "He wants a meeting." Thornton smiled thinly. "He'll get one, but not alone. You boys will be my insurance." They reached Thompson's Ferry by mid-morning. It was barely a town. A few buildings clustered around a river crossing, a trading post, a saloon. The ferry itself was a rickety flat-bottomed boat pulled across by ropes. Thornton positioned his men strategically, 2 in the saloon, 2 by the trading post. Clemens with him and Mara in the open area by the ferry landing. "When he shows himself, you take him," he instructed, "alive if possible, but dead works too." Noon came and went. The autumn sun beat down, and flies buzzed around the horses. Mara remained silent, but inside she was screaming. Where was he? Had something happened? Then she saw movement in the cottonwoods along the river. A figure emerged, tall, moving with familiar grace. Silas. But something was different. He wore paint on his face, traditional Shoshone war markings. In his hands was a rifle, and more weapons bristled from his belt. "Let her go, Thornton." His voice carried clearly across the space between them. "Why would I do that?" Thornton kept his hand near his pistol. "She's mine by law. Your law. Not the only law that matters here." Savage nonsense. But Thornton's voice held a trace of uncertainty. Silas smiled coldly. "You burned my home, killed my horse, took someone under my protection. By the laws of my mother's people. That requires answer. Blood for blood. You're threatening me. I'm offering you a choice. Release her, and you all ride away. Keep her. And..." He gestured to the hills around them. "You ever wonder why this area is so empty? Why even the army doesn't patrol here much? This is sacred ground, neutral territory. Bad things happen to men who violate its peace." It was a bluff, Mara realized, but delivered with such conviction that Thornton's men were shifting nervously. The wilderness pressed in around them, full of unseen menace. "You're alone," Thornton said, but it sounded like a question. In response, Silas gave a sharp whistle. Along the ridgeline, figures appeared, mounted warriors, faces painted, weapons ready. Mara's breath caught. Not Shoshone, she realized. These were different. Nez Perce, maybe, or Bannock. How had Silas... "My mother's people have long memories," Silas said calmly. "They remember who helped them, who traded fairly, whose word could be trusted. They also remember their enemies." The warriors remained motionless, but their presence changed everything. Thornton's men were looking to him for orders, fear evident on their faces. An Indian war was no one's idea of good business. "This is about her?" Thornton jerked his head toward Mara. "One woman. This is about honor, about choosing what kind of man you want to be. You can be the one who walked away, who showed wisdom, or you can be the one they find next spring, if they find you at all." For a long moment, the world balanced on a knife's edge. Then Thornton laughed. Harsh, bitter. "Keep her then. She's more trouble than she's worth anyway. Bad for business. Having a wife who won't be tamed." He pulled out a folded paper, the marriage certificate, and tore it in half, letting the pieces flutter to the ground. "There, no more claim. But know this, breed. You've made an enemy today. That's not something I forget." "I'll live with it," Silas replied. Thornton gestured sharply to his men. "We're leaving." "Boss," Clemens protested. Now. The word cracked like a whip. As they prepared to mount up, Thornton paused near Mara. You think you've won? You have no idea what you've chosen. A life of hiding, of scraping by in the wilderness with a half-blood nobody. You could have had comfort. Security. I could have had a cage, Mara interrupted quietly. A comfortable cage is still a prison. His face darkened, but he said nothing more. Within minutes, they were gone, riding hard toward civilization and away from the silent warriors on the ridge. Only when the dust settled did Mara realize she was shaking. Silas dismounted and came to her, cutting the last of the ropes that bound her wrists. She fell into his arms, and for a moment they just held each other. The warriors, she whispered. We'll be expecting the 2 horses and supplies I promised them, Silas admitted with a slight smile. They were passing through anyway, agreed to help for a price, but Thornton doesn't need to know that. She pulled back to look at him. The war paint, the weapons, the fierce determination that had driven him to follow her across miles of wilderness. You came for me. I told you I would. He touched her face gently. Are you hurt? No, not anymore. She meant it. The physical wounds would heal. The deeper ones, those would take time. But standing here in his arms, she felt something she hadn't experienced in so long. Safe. What now? She asked. Now we disappear. Head north like we planned. Find somewhere to start over. He paused. If that's still what you want. Instead of answering with words, Mara kissed him. Not the desperate kiss of before, but something deeper, surer. A promise. A beginning. When they finally broke apart, the warriors had melted back into the hills, and the sun was beginning its descent toward evening. They had no home to return to. Thornton had seen to that, but they had horses, supplies, and most importantly, freedom. North? Silas asked, helping her mount. North, Mara agreed. Together. They rode out as the sun set, leaving Thompson's Ferry and all its shadows behind. The mountains beckoned, vast and wild and full of possibility. Somewhere out there was a new life, a new chance. And for the first time in years, Mara Whelan rode toward tomorrow without fear. 3 years had passed since that day at Thompson's Ferry. The small cabin nestled in a valley of the Bitterroot Mountains bore no resemblance to the one Thornton had burned. This one was built better, stronger, a joint effort of 2 people who understood the value of home. Mara stood by the window, watching spring arrive in the valley. The Snake River, the same water that had aided her escape, ran clear and strong 100 yards from their door. She smiled, remembering how terrified she'd been of that water. Now it sang to her of constancy, of life renewed with each season. Letter came, Silas said, entering with an armload of firewood. Father Francis sent it up with the supply wagon. She took the worn envelope, recognizing the handwriting immediately. Her cousin in San Francisco, still faithfully corresponding despite the distance. The news was mostly domestic. Babies born, marriages made, the ordinary rhythms of life that seemed extraordinary when you'd fought so hard for your own. Any word from the courthouse? She asked. Silas nodded, producing another document. Official this time. The territorial judge ruled in our favor. Thornton's claim was invalidated on grounds of coercion and fraud. You're legally free. Have been for months now. Free. Such a simple word for something so hard-won. Mara set the papers aside and moved into Silas's arms. We should celebrate. Already am. He murmured into her hair. Every day I wake up next to you is celebration enough. They'd married, properly this time, in the small mission at Walla Walla. Father Francis had performed the ceremony, with a handful of Silas's mother's people and some of the other refugee women from the mission as witnesses. No contracts, no coercion. Just 2 people choosing each other. The early days hadn't been easy. Thornton had kept his word about being an enemy, using his influence to make trouble where he could. But his reach didn't extend into the deep mountains, and gradually, even his spite had faded as new interests claimed his attention. Last they'd heard, he'd sold the mine and moved to California, chasing some new venture. Sarah Morrison's coming by tomorrow, Mara said, thinking of the sheriff's wife who'd become an unexpected friend. She's bringing fabric from town. Another quilt. This one's special. Mara took his hand, placed it on her still flat belly. We'll need smaller blankets come winter. The emotions that crossed Silas's face, surprise, joy, a touch of fear, made her heart full. He dropped to his knees, pressing his ear to her stomach as if he could already hear their child's heartbeat. How long have you known? He asked softly. A few weeks. I wanted to be sure. She ran her fingers through his hair, now longer than when they'd met, showing threads of silver at the temples. Are you happy? Happy doesn't begin to cover it. He rose, kissing her deeply. A child, our child, raised free. Mara added firmly. No contracts, no chains, just love and choices. They spent the evening as they often did, sharing quiet conversation by the fire. Silas worked on a new bow while Mara sewed, her needle moving in steady rhythms. The domesticity of it still sometimes took her breath away, the simple pleasure of being in her own home, with someone who saw her as a partner, not property. I've been thinking, Silas said eventually, about what you said, raised free. There are others out there, women in situations like yours was, men too, sometimes contracts that aren't what they seemed, marriages that are prisons. He tested the bow's draw. We could help. Mara looked up from her sewing. A sort of underground railway. Something like that. We know the mountains, the safe routes. We have connections now. Father Francis, Sheriff Morrison, some of my mother's people. Small scale, careful, but maybe we could make a difference. The idea took root immediately. How many times had Mara wished for someone, anyone, to help her escape, to show her the way to freedom? Yes, she said simply. Yes, we should do this. And so they had, carefully, quietly. They'd become a station on an informal network. A woman fleeing a brutal husband in Oregon. A Chinese man escaping debt bondage in the mining camps. 2 young Irish sisters tricked into domestic service that was anything but. 1 or 2 a year. Never enough to draw attention, but enough to matter. Each success was a victory. Each person who passed through their hidden valley and went on to freedom elsewhere was proof that the world could change. One choice at a time. Spring gave way to summer, and Mara's body changed with the seasons. The child grew strong within her, and she often caught Silas watching her with wonder. His protectiveness might have chafed, but he never tried to limit her movements or choices. He simply made sure she had what she needed, a steady arm over rough ground, a cup of the herbal tea his grandmother swore by, quiet strength when the memories came calling, because they did come. Sometimes. Nightmares that woke her gasping. Moments when a sound or smell would throw her back to Thornton's cabin. Times when she couldn't bear to be touched, even gently. But these grew fewer as the months passed, replaced by new memories, better ones. Do you ever regret it? She asked one evening as they sat by the river. The life you had before. It was simpler. Silas skipped a stone across the water, considering, I had an existence before, now I have a life. There's a difference. Even with the danger, the isolation. What isolation? We have friends, work that matters, each other. That's more than most folks get. He pulled her close. Do you regret it? Never. The word came instantly, firmly. Not for a moment. As autumn arrived, painting the mountains gold and crimson, they received unexpected visitors. A small party of Shoshone, including an elderly woman who studied Silas's face with keen eyes before speaking rapidly in their language. My grandmother's sister, he translated for Mara, emotion thick in his voice. She heard about us, wanted to meet the woman who brought her great-nephew back to the people. The old woman approached Mara, gnarled hands gentle on her swollen belly. She spoke again, and Silas smiled. She says the child will be a bridge, between worlds, like us, but stronger for it. They stayed for 3 days, filling the cabin with stories and laughter. Mara learned a few words of Shoshone, while the elder women taught her remedies for childbirth and infant care. When they left, it was with promises to return when the baby came. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing their valley in pristine white, but the cabin was warm and well-stocked, filled with the fruits of their combined labor. Silas had hunted and trapped enough to see them through, while Mara had preserved vegetables from their garden and gathered medicines from the forest. On a night when the snow fell soft and silent, their son decided to make his entrance. The birth was hard. Births in the wilderness always were. But Sarah Morrison was there to help, and Mara drew on wells of strength she'd discovered in herself years before. When the baby's cry finally pierced the air, strong and vital, she wept with joy and relief. "A son," Sarah announced, placing the squalling bundle in Mara's arms. "Healthy as they come." They named him James Freedom Blacktree. James for Mara's father. Freedom for what they'd fought to give him. He had his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair, a perfect blend of two worlds. As winter deepened, they settled into new rhythms. The baby thrived on his mother's milk and his father's gentle lullabies, Shoshone songs mixed with Irish melodies. The cabin that had once sheltered two now held three, and the walls seemed to expand with love rather than shrink with crowding. One evening, as snow fell steadily outside, Mara sat nursing James while Silas stoked the fire. The scene was so peaceful, so far from the terror and pain of her flight, that she felt tears slip down her cheeks. "What's wrong?" Silas asked, immediately concerned. "Nothing. Everything." She smiled through the tears. "I'm just grateful. For all of it, even the hard parts, because they led me here." He kissed her forehead, then their son's downy head. "We made it," he agreed. "Against all odds. We made it." Outside, wolves howled in the distance. Not a threat now, but a reminder of the wild freedom that surrounded them. The river ran beneath its coat of ice, patient and eternal. And in a cabin built by two people who'd chosen love over fear, a fire burned bright against the darkness. Mara had followed the river to freedom and found so much more than escape. She'd found home, purpose, partnership. She'd found herself. And as she sat in the warmth of her own choosing, surrounded by love freely given and received, she knew that every desperate step through the wilderness had been worth it. The woman who'd fled in terror was gone. In her place sat Mara Blacktree, wife, mother, conductor on Freedom's railroad, keeper of her own destiny. She'd been broken once, but like bones that heal stronger at the break, she'd emerged more whole than before, and that, perhaps, was the greatest freedom of all. Thank you, dear listeners, for joining us around the campfire tonight to hear Mara and Silas's tale. Where are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let us know, whether you're by your own fireplace or perhaps under the stars like our heroes. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories of courage and redemption from the American frontier. We'd love to hear your thoughts on tonight's story. Until next time, may your trails be crooked, lonesome, dangerous, leading to the most amazing view. May your mountains rise into and above the clouds. Happy trails, partners.